Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I am Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the Michigan Department of Education, or MDE. At MDE, we promote and encourage teaching the rich and diverse history of our country and our world. The presentation you will see today intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We are proud to partner with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome our Library of Michigan colleagues, Melinda Babarskis and Kendall Dara, who will share how to find and use primary and secondary sources from the Library of Michigan as related to the novel Women of Copper Country and the nonfiction book We Kept Our Towns Going. And now I will turn it over to Mr. Scott Koenig, Social Studies Consultant in the Office of Educational Supports here at the MDE, to take us further into today's learning.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. Teaching Comprehensive History webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn, you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. It is my pleasure to introduce our friends Mindy Babarskis and Kendall Dara from the Library of Michigan. Mindy is a reference librarian at the Library of Michigan, where she coordinates the Michigan Notable Books program and manages the Michigan collection. She holds a BA, a Bachelor in History from Wheaton College, and an MLIS from Dominican University in Illinois. She worked in a variety of public academic and special collection libraries around the country for 14 years. She is happy to be back in her home state and serving the people of Michigan at the State Library. Kendall Dara has been a reference librarian at the Library of Michigan for 22 years, where she focuses on services to public collection development and assisting her colleagues with a variety of projects. Before becoming a librarian, Kendall taught high school German and sometimes English in Vienna, Austria, Oscoda, Michigan, and Utica, Michigan. She has volunteered extensively in schools as the parent of elementary children. Kendall holds a BA in German from Wayne State University, where she also did her teacher training, an MA in English from Michigan State University, and an MLIS from Wayne State University. Welcome, Mindy and Kendall.
Thank you all. We're going to go ahead and share our presentation with you today, but we're just so excited to be here. And we just appreciate all of our colleagues at the at the Michigan Department of Education. Let me get our, I'm going to have to get us back to our beginning slide real quick. Get a little sneak preview. Thanks. Yeah.
There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for giving your time to us while we talk to you about researching women in Michigan's labor movements. And we're excited about library research, so we're going to be talking about this from the perspective of librarians. First, we're from the Library of Michigan. And most people actually have never heard of the Library of Michigan, although we're your state library. The Library of Michigan was established by territorial law in 1828. That's 9 years before Michigan became a state. And we have two main purposes. We collect, preserve, and provide access to the story of the state of Michigan. Mindy and I are part of the unit at the library that does that. And we have another unit we call Statewide Services, and they support Michigan libraries in their roles as essential community anchors. If you talk to a public librarian in Michigan and mention the Library of Michigan, they know who we are. The Library of Michigan has many collections. These are open to the public. Not all state libraries serve the public directly. We do. Some of our major and most popular, most used collections are the Michigan Documents Collection. These are documents that are produced by the state of Michigan. They cover all different kinds of things, all sorts of reports. It's what your government is doing, what your government is producing. And we have things even like state fair recipes. So there's all kinds of fun stuff and boring stuff and important law stuff that's in that collection. The Michigan collection is stuff that's published about the state of Michigan, but not by the state. And this includes things like newspapers, periodicals, books, people's typescripts, somebody's letters. It's a broad collection. It's all sorts of neat things about the state from every possible perspective. It covers all the call number sections that you would find in any other library, but focuses on Michigan. We have a law library with a real live law librarian who has studied law. So there's a real specialized collection there with a specialized expert to help. And then we have a rare book collection that is quite eclectic. It's wide ranging. There's a lot about Michigan or from Michigan, but there's stuff from all sorts of places. So that's just super fun. We even have art books in there. And we are, again, your state library. We serve the entire state of Michigan and all of its residents, including children and your students. As part of our way of accomplishing our mission to the state, we provide direct services to the public. You can walk into your state library, come to the second floor, and you might find Mindy or me at the desk. We will help you with research while you're in the building. We may help you with finding stuff in the building. We might help you establish a research plan for, strategies for finding what you need, how you're going to go about doing it. We also do presentations like this one. You can email us, you can call us, you can send a postcard, write a letter. We're here to help. Our website tells a lot about us and gives you access to a lot of our resources right there from the website. And you can see the address for the website right there on the screen. And from our website, you can sign up for a library card, and your students can sign up for a library card as well, so that they can get to the databases that we provide that Mindy's going to talk about in a while. We have some goals for this presentation. One of them is to promote learning comprehensive history through research. So not just through reading a textbook, but through actual research. We also want to promote learning to research and learning related skills by studying comprehensive history. We want to promote learning comprehensive history through many skills and areas of interest. And we want to equip teachers to equip their students to continue to learn history for a lifetime. So what is our presentation really about? Student ownership of question-based learning. This is what people come to libraries for their whole lives. They have questions they're looking for answers to. And those are questions that are important to them. We're looking to provide ways to make connections between different disciplines. If you're doing research on a topic like we're going to discuss, you'll be covering more than just one thing, this thing called history. You will be covering lots of other areas too. This type of, we want to promote the development of research skills too. How students need to understand how to find information, but also that there is information to be found. It's not a big government cover-up. There's all sorts of stuff that they need to find, can find, might want to find when they're 35. Learning research skills is an important tool to get them through their lives. We want to teach information literacy, being able to look at different types of texts and understand what they are, how to evaluate them, developing those evaluation skills, which come through critical thinking. And we want to promote lifelong learning. We're librarians. That's our bread and butter. So we're promoting researching across the curriculum, but not only for teachers, also for the students. We see students involved in this research process, and we see it as integrating a wide range of subject areas. In social studies, if you're studying the women's movement and women in labor, you're going to be covering civics, economics, geography, and history. Easy. But when you're looking at the labor movements, different aspects of it, you'll be covering music specifically. Fine arts could get covered. If you're dealing with research, you're going to be practicing all sorts of writing skills, including contacting librarians, but also conveying the information that you're finding, putting that together into some sort of end product. If you're studying the labor movement, you need to know something about math and statistics. You can use those here. Students will be developing reading and listening skills in different areas that they might not be used to using in just textbook reading. They're going to be writing and speaking in different ways. Critical thinking and mathematical thinking, again, are really important. So when students are doing reading and writing across the curriculum, they're gaining and through research, they're gaining exposure to a wide variety of topics and texts that are related to reading skills. Mindy's going to show some examples later on where students would be confronted with some tables, statistical tables. They need to be able to read and interpret those. We'll be looking at oral history versus fiction. You need to know the difference or you're not going to be understanding what you're really looking at. But students will also be looking at library websites and figuring out what libraries have for services or information types of information that are available. There's a lot. And then finally, in this section, students will be doing correspondence and having conversations with librarians, which requires a relevant and cogent descriptions of the topics they're studying, the types of information they're looking for, and the specific questions that they're attempting to answer. Mindy and I deal with research requests or information requests from adults all the time who cannot do these things. They write, they ask vague questions, or they tell their entire life story, and you just are trying to find out what's the missing piece of information that you want. Students who can develop these skills, they may fail at times, but as they're developing these skills as students, will be way ahead because these skills are rare among adults.
It's funny, I had a question just like that today. It's a perfect example.
Yep. So if students are going to be researchers as part of their process of learning, they need some background information about the topic before they can develop questions that they want to learn more about. And so we're going to talk a little bit about books as springboards. And the two springboard books that we chose are a novel, The Women of Copper Country by Mary Doria Russell, and We Kept Our Towns Going by Phyllis Wong. The Women of Copper Country is a historic novel. It's about the 1913 Calumet miners' strike. This may not be widely known outside of Michigan or even in parts of Michigan. The farther north you go, the more you learn about it. And if you're interested in labor, this is a really important strike. The women in Copper Country weren't the miners. I don't know that there were any female miners at the time. They were the wives and daughters and mothers of the miners who needed to strike. And these women played an incredibly integral part. They were the organizers, they were the doers, they made things happen that the men didn't have time to do. And they had energy that the men hadn't spent doing their jobs. So the women were real partners in this strike. And without the work of the women, it's unlikely that the strike could have continued long enough to actually get anything done. One particular heroine of this story is Annie Clemmink. She's pretty famous. If you know about the strike, you know about Big Annie, and she's the main character in this novel. Her support and organizational skills, just as a woman who lived in the area, were essential to this strike. A little bit later in Michigan history is We Kept Our Towns Going. This is the history of the Gossard lingerie factory in the UP. There were two factories there, and then they had a few other factories. One was in Indiana, and they worked on first making corsets and then eventually bras. As the mining industry in the UP waned, so we've gone from, the Calumet miners' strike, but eventually there was less and less copper and iron to mine. So as the mining industry in the UP waned, families needed other sources of income, and women were a great source of income by working for the Gossard Company. So the women, the company only wanted to hire women to work on the sewing machines. So women were the main employees there. And eventually they decided that they wanted to unionize. They started the unionization process in 1941 and didn't actually achieve a union until 1949. This book is a history of the company in the UP. So they were based in Chicago, but their factories in the UP have a specific history. And it includes history by Phyllis Wong, but it also includes oral histories from women who worked in the factory. So you get the historian's perspective as well as the street view perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Using books as springboards, like these two, helps students develop questions by providing them context and some prior knowledge. If you just said, we're going to study the women's labor movement in the UP or in Michigan, these kids aren't going to know anything about that. But books like these set the stage. They introduce you to the major topics, the major themes, and give the kids an idea of what was going on, who the players were, even if that's not textbook. So when you're working with a historic novel or an oral history, you do need to treat them differently from, say, a vetted textbook where hopefully the facts are right. Historic novels can be based on fact or real events, or they can be an entirely new story set within a real historical setting. So eyes wide open, you need to know what you're presenting your students with. They have to be considered fiction, even if the author sticks close to the original events, like this novel, with this novel, it is fictionalized. There are things that the author had to fill in or make a little more exciting, make a little more interesting to keep the reader's attention, make this to really get to the story. However, there's plenty of fact in this book. So part of your students' work will be to sort through that. What is really true? And so you can't use a historic novel as a primary or even a secondary source for the information about the topic it covers. You can for other purposes, but not for the historic information. But a good story can capture a student's interest and be used as a springboard for research. Oral histories should be factual, but the reliability can be variable, right? We all know that witnesses' stories are different. We tell our stories in our own ways. Oral histories must be considered firsthand personal accounts. The information should be verified if that's possible. And they're useful as primary sources to tell you what happened. They're also useful as secondary sources, interpretations of what happened. And if you look at Phyllis Wong's book, you'll see some of that. How did these different women feel about the union, being part of the union, working for this company, working themselves? So there's no substitute for genuine eyewitness accounts, but all the research questions that emerge from those. Once students have some background information and maybe are enticed and excited about the topic, we would hope that they would be. If Mary Doria Russell's novel is pretty exciting. Then the kids can actually start doing research and investigating the questions they develop. But researchers need librarians and libraries. And libraries are everywhere in the United States. We have school libraries. Lots of schools have libraries. But if you don't have a school library, we have public libraries, digital libraries, college and university libraries often serve the public, especially through mail or email. Special libraries and archives, state libraries like the Library of Michigan, federal libraries and archives, they're all over. What do libraries have to offer? Local history collections. Those would be really important if you're studying women in the labor movement. Clipping files and scrapbooks. These are things that are special, they're rare, they are crafted by a community to fit a community's needs. Some libraries keep oral histories. The biggest, best known would be the Library of Congress's. They have all sorts of oral histories on recording. If you listen to NPR and you ever hear StoryCorps, those are oral histories that the Library of Congress is collecting. Libraries collect local newspapers and publications, things you might not be able to find anywhere else. They also employ local people who have connections to the location. And they have special collections that reflect their own special interests and their own quirkiness sometimes. Libraries also provide reference help to help students and other researchers look for specific information. Librarians can help identify where to find information they don't have. And they can help researchers develop research strategies that are based on what that library has. How do you select a library? Where do you even begin to look for a library that could help you? Start where the events took place. And I'll show you some with the UP and what we did with libraries, how I looked for libraries that might be able to help me research the women women of Copper Country and the Gossard girls. Look for libraries that have large selection of primary sources on your subject. And this might not be a local to the events library. It could be someplace like the state library or somewhere else. Look for libraries that specialize in your topic, and Mindy's going to talk more about that. Look for libraries that will work via email, online chat, or letter. Most do. There's contact information on most library websites, and I've done personal research this way where I've had questions I needed answers to, and I've written to libraries, and they've been very helpful. And I don't say, and I'm a reference librarian, and I still hear back from them. Library websites usually list contact information as well as list their special collections and services. So reading through a library website is really important with this kind of research that we're recommending. And then also, for the sake of your students and the librarians, focus on English-speaking countries or a country whose language you and your students speak and write. Please do not write to a library in another country that speaks another language and expect the librarian there to deal with reference questions in another language and have to write back in a foreign language to them. Some tools for finding the right libraries. The Michigan Library Directory is super, and you can get to that through the Library of Michigan's website. Archive Grid is another great tool that I learned about from Mindy. This tells about libraries and archives and what kinds of collections they have, what they specialize in, and how to get in touch with them. Google. I'm not supposed to say that as a librarian, but Google. Google Maps. I used Google Maps when I was preparing for this to find out where are libraries in the UP that are close to the events that I'm talking about. And you can ask a librarian. You can write to a library. I'm looking for libraries that specialize in this if you're really stumped. So libraries and archives that I found that could help me with researching the women's movement in Michigan, particularly in the UP, include Peter White Public Library in Marquette. And I've actually been to this library. It's really, really cool. So I knew it existed. I cheated. I asked a librarian
Yourself.
But I know that they have an enormous clipping file. So folders and folders and folders organized by topic of local history things that have been clipped from newspapers and magazines and all sorts of ephemera. So that's a library with lots of cool collections. Northern Michigan University, I checked their website online. They have a lot of information about mining and unions in the area. Michigan Technological University was established to support the research, to provide research for the mining industry, and they have a lot of information about mining and the mining industry in their libraries and on their websites. And then the Portage Lake District Library is in Houghton, which is near all of the mining country. And that library has a lot too. They also have local people working there who know about local connections, like professors that you might want to get in touch with, or local history organizations. So once students and teachers have identified some libraries to contact, it's time to get into the research. And Mindy is going to talk about some of the digital resources that are available and give examples of how to use those.
Yes. So there is a lot that is available online for free. Maybe you have to do some things like get a library card, but would be free to you and your students. So that's really what I'm going to focus on. There's a lot of things that are in print, and we discussed reaching out to these libraries through writing to see what they have, because maybe not all of their materials have been digitized, but I'm going to focus on the things that have been digitized or are digitally available to kind of help you get started and give your students a chance to explore on their own without having to travel to,
Right.
Houghton.
Well, and that's been a huge focus
Yeah.
for us, that students can't just get in the car and go to the UP. So we want to make this presentation relevant for what they can do.
And also teaching them some good literacy skills, both in research and navigation, and how to use a computer and how to search the internet and all that fun stuff. So I'm starting with really focusing on the online newspaper resources. Specifically, I wanted to kind of make you aware of two separate categories of how you're going to find online newspapers. There are a lot of databases. So you've probably heard of like newspapers.com. Some of you, if you're doing your own genealogy research, you've probably come across that. Those are going to be resources that you would either have to pay for, you'd have to have a personal subscription, or your library would have had to pay for to give you access as their user. So thankfully, with the Library of Michigan, there is a kind of two resources with what we can provide. We have mel.org, that's with us and MCLS. We combined our resources to really make Michigan Electronic Library a resource, a tool, a website that's available to all of Michiganders, all Michiganders. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Some of you may be familiar with that because I think many school libraries use the MEL resources. Then there's also the Library of Michigan databases that are available with our library card. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how you go about getting a library card, but these are things that we have paid for to provide access for you. You also will want to check with your school, public, local post-secondary institutions, because they may also have more newspaper databases or more online resources for you. If you're close to a big university, you can usually go into the university and access their online resources for free on one of their computers. So they have many more resources. A lot of that is because they've got to support the research that their students need to do and their faculty need to do. So they could have a lot for you and your students to use as well. The other kind of place that you'll find online newspapers is open and free database and digital collections. There's a great resource that if you're doing any research with Michigan newspapers, you need to take a look at, is the Clark Historical Library's Digital Michigan Newspaper Portal. And this is out of Central Michigan University. They have, by county, listed all of the papers that they've been able to locate that have been made digitally available, what years are available, whether you have to pay for it or whether it's free or hybrid. And it's just a great place to get started on that research. I probably use it weekly, if not daily, with my job. And then there's the Chronicling America out of Library of Congress, and that's going to have national coverage. So not just Michigan newspapers, but although Michigan is very well represented in their collections, they have been working to digitize newspapers across the country for the 400 years that 1600s to 1960s, and they have made those available to anybody for free. Now, not every newspaper has been digitized, and maybe only certain years, but they have another tool on there called the U.S. Newspaper Directory. This will let you know what newspapers we know exist and who has them in their collections, whether it's just a few print copies and what years they would have available. So it might be on microfilm, it might be some paper, it might be electronically, but that can get you started. Unfortunately, when it comes to newspapers, they were made to be read and thrown away. So there are many missing papers, missing years, some missing issues, but that's a helpful tool for your students to discover too, is that not all information is still around, even if we know it existed at one point. So I'm going to talk to you about MEL a bit. There are some excellent resources I want to make you aware of on this website, mel.org. And I also want to make sure you know that it's freely available to all Michigan residents. It should authenticate just by geolocation. If it doesn't, you might have to put in your driver's license or your public library card if they participate in MEL. But these resources are wonderful, both e-resources and the MELCAT system. So this is a giant catalog that shows you, library catalog, I should say, not like a Sears catalog. And this library catalog, it shows you where you can find different resources, and you could request to have, this book from Michigan State University Library or Grand Valley State University Library sent to your public library in Owasso. And it's wonderful. You don't, all you have to do is put in your library card number, say what you want, and then that library would send it to your public library. You could go to your public library to pick it up, check it out, and you've got it for whatever the time is. I think it's 28 days, I want to
So I
say.
think it's usually 3 weeks.
3
and then
weeks.
You can renew it, and you can borrow up to 50 items, 50 items at a time.
I didn't know that part, so that's really cool.
I'm a heavy user.
You're a heavy user. Librarians, we're a heavy user of other libraries. So, you've got that physical items that you can request through the MELCAT. You've got the digital items that you have access to with the e-resources. You also have a lot of tools for educators. That's the, in our slide, I've got the little image of the banner, and the far right, you see there's educators option. If you select that, there's going to be information on how to use these resources, and also a contact for someone who can really help you with further using MEL in your classroom. I wanted to highlight a few of the e-resources that are available because there's around 80 e-resources, so there's a lot to go through. For social studies and kind of a secondary school setting, you're probably going to want to take a look at Explora for middle schools and high schools. That has a good, mixture of reference resources, secondary resources. The Newspaper Source Plus, it's not a lot of historical newspapers. It goes back to about 1980s, but would be really helpful depending on your topic, and could also help your students with that secondary sources. How do we talk about these historical events, 50, 60, 70 years down the road? And then there's the Gale and Context Opposing Viewpoints. This has a mixture of both primary and secondary sources and can get your students looking at different perspectives on the same topic, which is always a helpful tool. Now for the Library of Michigan databases, most of my examples are going to come from our databases because, well, that's what I'm using. And I also want to make you aware of them because anybody who is a current resident of Michigan can apply to get a library card. It's just michigan.gov/library card. You would fill out the form, and this does also include your students. So your students could also do this. They would fill out the form, submit it, give about a week for that to be processed. We do it manually, our circulation staff. And then they will email you back or your student back with their library card number and instructions on how to set up a password to access the resources. We have a full list of our online resources on our website, michigan.gov/LM databases, which I'm going to show you what the page would kind of look like so you know how to navigate it. It's a tabbed system. So we've taken all of those online resources and sorted them by type. Yeah, type's a better word than subject area, type. We're going to look at the newspapers periodicals, some from the newspapers periodicals list, which is the last tab. So you'd need to select that newspapers periodicals tab to actually bring up the alphabetical list of what we have available. There are ebooks. I would definitely take a look at the ebooks, specifically our ProQuest eBook Central database. This has We Kept Our Towns Going. Digitally available, it's unlimited users, so all of your students could be looking at it at the same time. They can download chapters from it, they can print things off. And we wanted to make sure that that was something that could be available to all Michiganders who got our library card. There's also family history and general reference resources. Some of those may be applicable for your students, so definitely do take a look. You might find something that would be good for them to use. Most of our databases are remotely accessible, which means you can access from the comfort of your home, from your cell phone. There is Ancestry is one that you would have to come into the library to access, but I don't foresee a lot of people using Ancestry for their history classes, but it's something to be aware of, that they unfortunately took away remote access for libraries.
Possibly, or census,
But yeah, census there, I mean, there is some
And-
stuff in there,
and that's available through MyHeritage in Mel.
which, yeah, so another
So
good
there's
resource.
a good alternate because you can't use Ancestry
Yeah.
from home.
They don't let you do that.
Yep.
So let's say I've gone to that webpage. I've now selected the newspapers periodicals list, and I'm looking for, I want to find some articles on this Gossard girls strike that took place in 1949. I had read about it in the We Kept Our Towns Going book, and I want to delve into that a little more. This is an activity that you or your students could do, or you could do kind of a hybrid. I'm going to use this as an example. So I'm looking at this list of newspapers and I see, we've got access to the Escanaba Daily Press. Well, that's not too far away from Ishpeming and Gwyn. You know, that would probably get a more local perspective than, say, Lansing State Journal. So I'm going to go ahead and do a little searching in there. So I do some searching and I come across an article. What's great is I can then take this article, either, print it off and have my students dissect it, or me as the student take a look at it and use that article as a jumping off point to start finding these research avenues. So start collecting, okay, who are some people I need to be researching? What do I need to be looking into? Where do I need to go? When do I need to be doing my search? Like, what time frame should I be limiting this to? And it also gives me ideas of what other resources might talk about my topic. So I did a little example of this. I found an article from the Escanaba Daily Press that took place, that was from the April 25th, 1949 issue. And the title, if you can't see it, is Union Asks State Inquiry of Fracas. Fracas? Fracas. I knew Kendall would know how to pronounce it. At Gwyn Factory. So really what this article talks about is that there was a driver and she drove and hit some picketers who were at the Gwyn Factory for the strike from the Gossard girls. And the AFL, International Ladies Garment Workers Union, said, this is sketchy. We want the state to investigate this and look into what happened. So even though it's a tiny little article, there's a lot of information packed into here. So I'm seeing, okay, who are maybe some people I want to look a little more into? Well, this Mrs. Catherine A. Laveau, who was the driver of a car that hit the picketers. This now gives me some other research avenues I could look at. What are some other documents that would have information on her in this incident? Well, there's probably going to be documents from the court case because it's not legal to hit people in a car. So I'm going to now know, I might need to go to that county court and see what documents they would have available on this. Also, because this was a big deal, hitting someone with the car is big news in any place. There's going to be reporting in future issues of the newspaper and probably from other newspapers in the area, because this would have been big news. It's also, we're looking at the what beyond the driver hitting the picketers. Within this article, the AFL, International Ladies Garment Workers Union, it's a mouthful, is they're seeking a state investigation. So this lets me know, oh, there's now going to be a paper trail. Anytime you get the government involved, there's a paper trail. So there are going to be state documents available. Also, when you have an organization, a big international organization involved, there's also going to be documents. So I might even want to look at what institutions would have documents and papers from the AFL, or even reaching out to the AFL to get access to their materials. It's also letting me know where, okay, well, this happened at the Gwyn factory, but it's not just the Ishpeming plant that's striking. Now they're trying to get the Gwyn factory to strike. That now gives me more local collections and archives and libraries to look at. When I've got the date when the article is published. It also mentions that this incident happened last Wednesday, so I'd have to do a little bit of, okay, what would have been last Wednesday from this date? And then it also mentions that this driver is awaiting examination on May 3rd on a charge of felonious assault. So now I know, okay, I've got dates to look at in the newspaper to find more articles, more reporting on this incident. And this also helps me with my next activity that you could do of building a timeline. Now, this seems kind of simple. You're like, well, yeah, you kind of need to know when the events of this historical thing happened. But the activity of going through and searching for documents to support the timeline that they may already know after they've done some reading, now you're having them find other research avenues and do other research skills. Excuse me. So I just did a very mini timeline as an example. Obviously, you could have it be much more comprehensive, or you could just say, hey, find 3 articles. You can kind of expand it or contract it as works best for your students. But I did a little timeline of when the strike began. So I found an article from the Evening News from the Sault Ste. Marie paper. Again, notice I'm also using different newspapers because I want students to have that experience of looking at the reporting in different papers and from different locations, and how does that affect it? We'll talk a little bit more about that in our next example. But we have Evening News, March 29th, 1949, strike set in Ishpeming garment shop. That's going to tell me, oh, here's the beginning, here's the basic information. It's also giving me some new names that I could look into. This Miss Geraldine Gordon, who's the representative for the union. It's giving me more research avenues, more ideas of what I need to know to understand this event. Then I also know, okay, I've got to look forward in time because now I've got the starting point, what's going to happen in the middle. I did another version of what we found in the Escanaba press of the Miss Laveau hitting the picketers. And this was in the Detroit Free Press. So again, not local, but they can compare like how are things talked about, what's the reporting like, and that kind of gives a good central point. And I know, okay, well, the strike is still happening. They're trying to get it moved to the Gwyn factory. So I got to keep looking forward in time in the newspapers and searching in newspapers.com. I opened it up to the whole country. And here I discover, oh, the strike did move beyond the borders of the UP, beyond Michigan, and into Indiana, to their Indiana factory. So this article from the Terre Haute Tribune mentions that the strike has ended in the UP and there's hope for a settlement for the Indiana factory. And that gives me a timeline of, okay, it's wrapping up around July of 1949. So now I've got that timeline, and that's giving me a good skill set. I mean, it's giving me a good background knowledge of, okay, this is what the event looks like, some great names, some great ideas of where to go from here. That's one tool or one example of how you can use newspapers in a creative way to really get students thinking about research and using those research skills. Another way that I focused, or kind of I'm going to show an example of, is teaching your students information literacy, critical thinking skills, news literacy in a way that, you know, when it's looking at historical papers, it takes away a lot of the baggage that comes from news literacy with current events. So I really looked at News Literacy Project. This is a nonpartisan education nonprofit that was founded in 2008 to really help people with learning news literacy skills. And it really focuses on youth and education. So they're trying to help students before they graduate high school by giving them some knowledge so that they can participate in civic society as well-informed critical thinkers. And there's a button on that homepage that is for educators. I looked specifically at, they have a nice PDF called In Brief News Media Bias. And it's just a nice little one-page thing that talks about media bias forms and media bias types and has some good questions. So that was sort of my tool for this next activity. I decided, oh, you know what? This would be a great way for me to teach my students about how we investigate media bias types. And specifically, we're going to look at corporate bias. So that's a pretty easy thing to show when you're researching the Copper Country strike that took place in Calumet in 1913. What's wonderful about Chronicling America, I mentioned that U.S. newspaper in directory. You can, not only do they tell you which libraries have holdings for this paper, they also will give you a little history about the paper itself. So I highlighted a couple sentences as to why it's important for your students to take a look at this and to delve into, oh, I want to look at the local news for this event. Well, maybe I should look at what's the story behind this local newspaper. So I'll just read it to you because it's a little small. Like its predecessor, the Calumet News was effectively controlled by the mining interests in Michigan's Copper Country. This would become particularly important as the paper reported on the copper strike of 1913-1914. So that's going to let me know that there's probably, I'm going to need to look at some other resources as well. There's probably going to be some corporate bias in the reporting for the Copper Country strike. And Kendall will give you a good example of how she saw this in action.
Yep, it's real. Bias is real. A couple years ago, I was doing some research with this paper. It had a different name at the time. And I was looking into the Calumet miners' strike. And I don't remember the date that the strike started, but I started looking around the time the strike began. And there was nothing in the paper. There was no report of any kind about a strike happening. Nothing. And so I started looking around for more information about that, and I found out that the miners actually had to start their own newspaper to get any coverage of the strike for quite some time. And so the miners started the Miners Bulletin. And of course, that paper was entirely from the miners' perspective. But what was really interesting was not only they had to write their own newspaper and that the union helped finance this, they couldn't get a press to print the paper in the area because all of the presses were owned by the companies, the mining companies. So even writing and producing their own newspaper was hard, and they couldn't do it without help from the union to help finance it and even find a press, an actual press that they could print the paper on. Reading through the time period of that that strike in both these papers is fascinating, just to compare the difference between them. And when when the Mining Gazette, that's the company-owned paper, finally started talking about the strike, it was disparaging. Right before Christmas, during the strike, there was this horrible cartoon of this drunken miner who's near passing out, sitting, you know, at the table at the bar, doing nothing. And it was this nasty cartoon about, you know, look at what your daddy's getting you for Christmas or something. The next day was a terrible disaster called the Italian Hall disaster, where the miners and their families were having a Christmas party, and something happened and people thought there was a fire, and they all just tried to leave at once, and they crushed each other trying to get out, and there was no fire. So the next day there was this we're so sorry about the miners, and isn't this terrible, on Christmas Day, after there'd been this horrible cartoon the day before. So just studying the difference in the newspaper coverage can be fascinating. That alone could, wow, what an important lesson for students today.
Yes.
Thanks.
And then not only are you just looking at, oh yeah, this corporate bias is going to change what is reported and how it's reported, it also helps introduce students to the tone. So a media bias form of like, well, let's look at the tone of this reporting and compare it with another paper. So knowing this corporate bias is existing for the Calumet News, we can look at an article about the same event from September 30th, 1913, that is reported in the Detroit Times. So farther removed, doesn't have the corporate interests in quite the same way as the Calumet News. I'll just read you the headlines. We're not even looking at the meat of the article, which is fascinating in and of itself. But it would really be a great example for your students of looking at how the same event is reported, what tone is used. So for the Detroit Times, striking miners drive back train bearing 50 of company's deputies. Pretty straightforward, basic journalists. This is what happened. There were these 50 of these company deputies, and the striking miners drive them back. If you look at the Calumet News, wild scenes are enacted early today. Picketing of violent nature resorted to by strikers and women's sympathizers. Mine guards are fired on. So they're not called company deputies, they're mine guards. So even the terminology used to describe the different actors is different, you know, women sympathizers. It's just fascinating and could really be a helpful lesson, I think, for your students. When it comes to those online newspapers, that's one facet of research that you can do. And that's going to teach them skills of, you know, it's pretty compact reading. They're not having to read very long articles. You're getting a lot of information in a short amount of space. So really good reading skills, reading comprehension skills. Yeah. But there are other tools, other digital resources that are going to teach your students different skills and help them connect with different topics and research areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about most of the things listed here, focusing on those freely available digital collections through a few different places. So there are academic libraries and archives that have their usually manuscript and photograph collections, things that are a little more of this unpublished nature, but really important from a primary source needs for your student. There are many of them that have been digitized, so I focused on Michigan Tech University, their archives and historical collections, and then the Wayne State University Walter P. Reuther Library, because they specialize in labor history in the US. So even though they're not in the UP, they're going to have a lot of information on these strikes in the Upper Peninsula, because that's what they're collecting on. That's their focus area. There's also some wonderful resources I'll touch on real quick at the National Archives and Library of Congress. These are kind of more, I'm going to talk more about their educator resources, where they're going to give you more information of how to teach these primary sources that they have digitized. And then there's also consortium and digital repositories. So the UP Link, Upper Peninsula Digital Network, is a consortium of a lot of different libraries, historical societies that have digitized parts of their collections and put it up in the UP Link website, which is hosted by Northern Michigan University. So they're going to have a lot of different manuscript, photos, local history type resources available there. How Do You Trust and Internet Archive, those are going to be more books. So these are published materials predominantly that are digitally available. And How Do You Trust is especially strong in government documents. So when I was talking about when the government gets involved, there's a paper trail. Definitely take a look at How Do You Trust.
Right.
These are freely available ebooks. Not everything that's on How Do You Trust is 100% available, but there's a lot in there that you can, that your students can use.
Yep.
Oh, no, you're good. Now, the reason why we really want to get your students connected to these digital collections, these manuscript collections, specifically, they're predominantly going to be at academic libraries and archives, but not totally. This is a chance for that correspondence piece. This is a chance for them to reach out to these really knowledgeable librarians and begin that writing and reading and communication skill set that they're going to need to know what a library has in their collections. I just focus on a couple things. So as your students are navigating these websites, specifically for archives, they're going to come across finding aids. It's kind of a weird tool, but I like to think of it as it's the table of contents for a collection. Sometimes an index if it's nice and deeply detailed. So it's the closest thing to like a table of contents for a book. It's going to be the table of contents for a big collection, usually with lots of boxes of materials. So I just kind of showed two different examples. The one on the left is Northern Michigan University that I found through the UP Link website, and it's specifically Geraldine DeFont's papers. She was a union organizer and she was involved in the 1949 Gossard Girls Strike. So she had a wonderful interview that she gave talking about that strike specifically. And what's really great is that someone digitized that transcript and made it available right there on that finding aid. So sometimes your students are going to luck out. They will just be able to find exactly what they need, digitally available, click on it, read what they need, cite it. They're good to go. Sometimes that will happen. Then there's other times where there's finding aids are just going to be a nice PDF that gives a good little box and folder listing of what you're going to find. So Michigan Tech, their historical archives and collections, they have some incredible collections specifically around mining. And one that was very relevant if you're doing Copper Country Strike 1913 research is the Calumet and Hecla Mining Company's collection. So this is one of those mines that owned, or this is one of those companies that owned one of the mines that the miners were striking at. and was also the one that owned the Calumet News. So lots of fun stuff in that collection, but it's just a PDF. So your students are going to have to open it up and have to be able to navigate it. So what they're going to find when they open that is, with these finding aids, you need to first figure out, is this actually a collection that is relevant to my research? It may be like, yeah, that's the exact company I'm researching, but you're going to need to look at the summary of the contents, the scope of the collection, and some of the content notes, because it may be about that company, but it's 20 years before the time period. They only have the 20 years before that event took place. So you're going to need to pay attention to the dates and what's actually covered in this collection. And does it actually have what I need? So that's going to be some good research skills for them right there. Critical thinking of, what do I actually need? It's also going to list the item types, which is going to get your students thinking about, okay, what's the ideal source that will help answer my question? As I'm writing my research, do I need more, data? Do I need more financial information? Or do I really need more of that personal narrative? I need to know what was the experiences of the people going through this. So what personal letters, what oral histories are there in this collection? That's going to help them narrow to what box and folder they need access to, because a lot of these manuscript collections are dozens, if not hundreds of boxes long. And you know what? Your students don't have a lifetime to do research on this. We want this to be maybe at most a semester long research project. This is not something we want them to be spending their whole high school career on. So I'm going to have to look at that listing and see, okay, where will I find the most relevant information? I'm going to have to do some Control F searching for keywords to see what folder can I reach out to a librarian and say, hey, can you take a look at this folder and maybe scan and send me materials that would have this information? So again, it's helping them narrow down, what do I need? How much do I need? Really getting them to think through that process. And you'll find some pretty interesting things, let me tell you. There was, for that Calumet and Hecla mining companies, there was a folder labeled List of Strikers in Company Houses, Undesirables, 1913. So that's already giving me clues that that's probably a folder I'm going to want to look at.
Wow.
Because you're seeing the effect of, not only were these strikers' jobs at risk, they were trying to get better pay and make sure they still had their job, their housing is at risk now too. So that's also giving your student more context of, these companies really did rule the community. They were the town. And then beyond manuscript collections, which can seem pretty insurmountable sometimes. So, you definitely want to help chunk it out for your students. Something that's maybe a little more accessible for most students, I would say, is searching in photograph collections. This also really helps with making the history come alive. It's not a dry report or, financial information, but it's going to be something that you see the people, you see the place. And I'm going to use the Walter P. Reuther Library as my example. They have a labor movements and organizations collection in their image galleries. So within that, this is sort of my example activity you could do with your students. Just take a couple pictures from that image gallery, or, have them search and find something and have them go through and just talk about, what stands out to them when they're looking at it. What other clues for research are they getting? What things really surprise them, even after they've been doing all this research? Get them to really engage with the history. This is also a great way to bring in that fine arts curriculum piece. Specifically when I look at these two photos, one thing that stands out to me is the presence of the American flag in both of these. Here on the picture on the left is Copper Country Strike Annie Clemenc, 1910s. It's a studio portrait of Big Annie holding her trademark American flag. So she was always with this American flag. And you're seeing this Copper Country Strike demonstration. Miners and their supporters fill the streets of Calumet during a strike parade, and they all have American flags. So what's the symbolism here? You know, for these strikers, this was seen as a patriotic activity. This is seen as participating in the American system. So that can really get your students thinking about what that means and what that, you know, activism and all of that goes with it. The other thing that really stands out to me is the prevalence of women and children and how this really was a communal affair. You know, Big Annie she's called the heroine of the Copper Country Strike. The parade demonstration, I mean, it's families all over the place. There's kids, there's women. This was not something that was just the workers. Everybody was involved. And so to me, those were things that stood out, that your students may see something different though. So it's a lot of fun to really see what stands out to your students and get them to engage with history in a different way. Now, the part that might be a little harder to sell to your students, but just as important from a research and critical thinking standpoint, are government documents and reports in general. So this was searching I did on How Do You Trust? Remember I said it's very strong in government documents and reports. And I used these two examples to really show the different kinds of reports that you would come across and how they're gonna get you thinking about engaging with different reading. So we have statistical reports on the left. Those are going to be talking about the quantitative effects of the event. This example is the selected wage changes from Bureau of Labor Statistics for July and August 1949. So they do a monthly report on wage developments at different companies in the country. And this little tiny line, it's just one line, talks about the H.W. Gossard Company in Ishpeming, Michigan. You know, how many workers were affected by this wage change? What is the specific wage adjustment? So this is that economics, right? Now these women are going to be getting an average of 7.5 cents for each piecework. And the way that you made these corsets and bras is a lot of piecework. So that's going to add up. That's going to make a real difference to these women. And, you know, it's just going to get your students thinking about, okay, it may just be one line and it's pretty dry. It's going to be teaching them that technical reading and trying to understand statistics and math and how this would, you know, compound and be something that would really make a difference. But it's getting your students also to realize, you know, this is the end result of all that work. It's just a single line. Right. It's just a single line in a government report. But that was months of protests, years, of work to get into the union. The report on the right is a letter from the Secretary of Labor. And it's talking about the strike in the copper mining district of Michigan. And it's in response to a Senate resolution. This is going to be a lot more comprehensive. They're going to be interviewing all the affected parties. And they're going to include a lot of details of events and people involved. So it's going to be very thorough. I will also say a report like that is a great way to help them investigate authority and purpose. So I did find a report, not by a government entity, that I thought would be a great comparison. And it's kind of another example for you. The one on the left, again, was that strike in the copper mining district of Michigan from federal government. It's from the Department of Labor, and it was in compliance with the resolution of the Senate from 1914. And they're supposed to give this report in regards to the strike. And the goal is really, they're working as mediators on behalf of the Department of Labor to secure an adjustment of the dispute, either by mediation or arbitration. So this is going to help your students look at, okay, what's the authority behind this source? You know, who had the power to write this and publish it? And then what was the purpose of it? So it's getting them to think those critical thinking skills. It's not just a report that I can just take at face value. I've got to look at who's behind it, what was their purpose. The report on the right is from the Copper Country Commercial Club, and it was a strike investigation by the committee of this Copper Country Commercial Club. And in it, they tell you a little bit about who they are and how they were formed. But what was interesting is when you see that the Copper Country Commercial Club is an organization of 500 businessmen and others of Houghton and Keweenaw counties, whose purpose is to do these different things. They're trying to, we're for tourism. We're trying to get people to move here, to work here, all this very flowery language. But when you look at, okay, who's made up the committee? These are all the businessmen who own the mines and whose interests are being affected by the strike. So that's already going to give some red flags for your students as to, I'm not going to be able to take this report at face value. I'm going to need to look somewhere else. So even though reports may seem dry, you can make them a little more interesting and using that comparison piece. And lastly, I'm going to touch on the educator resources that are available for free from the Library of Congress and the National Archives. They both have dedicated websites to helping teachers teach with primary resources. The image on the left that I use is from the teacher's blog that Library of Congress has. And this one's specifically a roundup of Labor Day resources for teachers. It's not going to be just Michigan specific, but they're going to be getting your students to engage with this topic in a way that's probably really well vetted, because this is coming from the Library of Congress, and these excellent primary sources. So National Archives, they've got a whole lot too, if you know how to teach with documents, right? They've got tools for you as well. So I really wanted to make sure I touched on those. And I'll let Kendall take us home.
And I'll say I've looked at Library of Congress's resources for teachers before, and there is a lot there, more than we have time to cover, that would be really worth exploring. Their educator resources, just thinking ahead for any of your student work. I want to come back briefly to books again and mention one more time MELCAT, the statewide interlibrary loan system, and mention a few specific books that I think are really neat, that go well with teaching about the labor movement in general. One is a fairly new book called The Art of Protest. There are many books by that name. This one is by Dean Nichols, and it's geared probably towards middle school to college age. The reading level is not hard. The book is all about sort of the history and types of art that have been used in protests, but also how to make it. And they're all different forms: signs, t-shirts, stencils, you name it, it's in there. It's a really fun book. This book would be perfect to include with a large project that covers labor, where students would actually be producing their own art of protest. Maybe they're strikers. Maybe they're anti-strikers. Maybe there's somebody who's like, I just want whatever product it is back on the shelf. So you could really, the students could really have fun with a book like The Art of Protest as part of what they're using. Labor unions and labor movements are also famous for their music. Labor unions have created songbooks, but there are huge collections of songs from the labor movements. I listed two that we have here at the Library of Michigan. They're older books. Does it matter? There's still newer books out there. Melcat gives you access to library collections from around the state. There are thousands of libraries involved in Melcat, including university libraries, including schools or collections that would include music from labor protest songs. Some libraries that participate in Melcat also will circulate recordings, CDs. So that's a super resource to look through, what's there that would meet my students' needs, or the students could look for. And then I want to mention one more specific writer, but there would be others like him. Studs Terkel was writing, I think, in the 60s and 70s, and he talked to people about their work. One title, Working People Talk About What They Do All Day and How They Feel About What They Do, is wonderful. This is exactly the kind of oral histories that help students get to see what is the world of work like for real people and a wide variety of them. So Melcat could be your friend. It's a huge resource to getting to other books, and your students can use this all by themselves. And then as we think about researching across the curriculum and doing things outside of just the history or social studies classroom, I'll emphasize music again, but also museums. Lots of museums have things online now, but wouldn't it be great to go to a museum that also deals with the stuff in person? Movies and plays, and lots of those are available in databases through public libraries. Canopy and Hoopla both have movies, and tons of other things, TV shows, documentaries. Those are also available in Canopy and Hoopla and other similar databases. And I'd like to point out a website that comes from the Foundation for Teaching Economics. This is I found it while we were researching for this this program, and it knocked my socks off. Economics is a really important topic that people just see as boring. This is the machinery that makes things like labor movements happen. It's the machinery behind the workers as well as the businesses, and it can't be emphasized enough. A good understanding of economics is huge. Students can be producing art and poetry and performances. This doesn't just need to be all written down, typed, double-spaced, so many words. And then all sorts of creative forms of information dissemination. Your students could be writing their own newspapers for multiple different views. And they could also be creating a living museum as part of a project that shows what they've learned. So we thank you so much for coming to our presentation and for your attention and giving your time. This is contact information on the screen for reaching the Library of Michigan, actually doing real research, contacting research librarians. And I'll give it back to Scott now. I think he's fielding questions. Could you let us know if there are any you need answered?
Hey, Kendall, Mindy, this is fantastic. Just one quick one. There was several praises and comments and thanks to crossing disciplinary spaces and work here. Big Annie comes up. Did you happen to come across any more around why Big Annie on slide 30 so that you had shared?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
ahead.
Big Annie, she's all over the newspapers, and she's that core figure in the Women of Copper Country. And as you're researching the Copper Country strike of 1913, she's going to come in. She was one of the big organizers, so she really helped to keep that strike going. She is called out in person
Right.
You know, and sometimes as Big Annie, sometimes as Mrs. Clemenc, sometimes as Annie Clemenc. So when you're researching Copper Country strike in 1913, she is a major player and not alone. Yeah.
Right. Annie would be a really interesting person to study too, for how a person becomes famous and what they become famous for. You could see in the photo of her that she's lovely. So she really had a great look. She was an exceptionally tall woman, so she stood out in a crowd. She was a real alpha female. She was, whether she was afraid or not, you never saw it. She put herself out there. She went to jail.
Yeah.
I
I think multiple times.
Yeah, she really did suffer. So you have this beautiful woman that there's a lot you could study just with how a person like her becomes a figurehead, where she was also a real life human with real live human faults. And you know how that kind of thing gets whitewashed, that alone could be an interesting study.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna steal some comments that came through to close our presentation today for the two. But most definitely, these were one of the questions that comes up in social studies from social studies educators is resources. Get us resources. And this presentation and the links we dropped in that Kendall and Mindy shared with us, there's no lack of resources being shared in this if you're an attendee here. So thank you, Kendall and Mindy, for that. And resources that go beyond social studies that can be used in any disciplinary space. And even to the point of you brought in math in this and analysis and analytics, right? Of which could even, promote the concepts of students going into other areas through social studies, math areas using social studies. So I just think it's brilliantly done, the modeling you presented for our educators and really creating the importance of, slowing down to go faster down the road, that take the time to learn how to research and learn how to use our clues with students, and modeling how to do that for students like you did for us is so important for success, particularly in social studies, as we become researchers in this space. But we thank you both for sharing your expertise with us. Now is a great time for attendees to select any links in the chat feature that have been presented. Dr. Rice reminds us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich, complex history. These powerful webinars, along with the provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge so they may share with their students. As searing as some of our history is, we have a responsibility to teach it all.